The idea that you could order sunlight sounds like something that belongs in science fiction, the kind of concept that feels interesting for a moment but doesn't really hold up once you think about how the world actually works. Because sunlight has always been something that arrives on its own terms, something that shows up and disappears without asking, following a cycle that no one controls and no one questions. So the assumption has always been simple. If you need light, you wait for it, and if it's not there, you create your own. What's changing now is not the presence of sunlight, but the way we think about it. Because sunlight has never really been scarce. It's always there, constantly hitting the Earth from space in a steady, uninterrupted stream, unaffected by clouds, unaffected by time of day, unaffected by anything happening below the atmosphere. And the only reason we don't experience it continuously is because the Earth rotates, turning different parts of the planet away from that stream at different times, which creates the illusion that sunlight itself comes and goes, when in reality it's always present, just not always directed toward us. And direction, unlike sunlight, is something we've learned how to control. Once you start looking at it that way, the idea becomes less strange, because the problem is no longer about generating light or storing it or replacing it, but simply about redirecting something that already exists in abundance, which is exactly what a new group of companies is trying to do by placing reflective systems in orbit that can capture sunlight and send it back down to specific locations on Earth, not everywhere and not constantly, but with enough precision to make it useful. At first, it's not obvious why this matters, because most places on Earth already receive sunlight every day, and even when they don't, artificial lighting fills the gap so effectively that the absence of natural light doesn't feel like a major limitation. But that assumption starts to break when you look at regions where sunlight doesn't just reduce, but disappears entirely for extended periods of time. In Tromsø, for example, winter doesn't just bring shorter days, it brings a period where the sun never rises at all, where time continues normally, but daylight never arrives. And across large areas of Siberia, daylight becomes so brief and inconsistent that it barely functions as a stable part of the day, which means that everything from daily routines to infrastructure has to adjust around the absence of something that most of the world takes for granted. Life continues in these places, but it doesn't continue unchanged. Artificial lighting replaces natural cycles, energy consumption rises, and entire systems are built around compensating for the lack of sunlight, not just in extreme regions, but in any environment where continuous light is required, such as construction sites that operate through the night, ports that function around the clock, or remote areas where maintaining lighting infrastructure requires constant fuel and maintenance. And in all of these cases, light is available, but it comes at a cost that is usually hidden in the form of energy, logistics, and infrastructure that has to be sustained just to maintain visibility. The idea of solving this from space isn't new, and in fact, it was attempted decades ago in a way that, at the time, seemed just as unlikely as it does now, when Russian engineers launched the Znamya project, placing a large reflective mirror into orbit with the intention of capturing sunlight and redirecting it toward the Earth, not as a permanent solution, but as a demonstration of what might be possible. For a short period, the system worked. A beam of reflected sunlight moved across the surface, visible as it passed, proving that the concept itself was not only possible, but achievable with the technology available at the time. But what it also revealed was how difficult it was to control. Because maintaining precision from orbit is not a static problem. It's a continuous calculation involving movement, rotation, and alignment that has to be adjusted in real time, since the satellite moves at high speed while the Earth rotates beneath it, and the target location, while fixed on the ground, is only aligned with the system for a limited window of time. So even a small deviation in angle or timing shifts the beam away from where it's supposed to go, which is why the early system struggled to maintain stability and ultimately couldn't continue. Not because the idea failed, but because the control required to make it useful wasn't yet achievable. What's different now is not the concept, but the level of precision we can apply to it. Companies like Reflect Orbital are essentially trying to turn sunlight into something that can be scheduled and delivered, using a network of satellites equipped with large, lightweight mirrors that stay in orbit and continuously adjust their position relative to the Sun and the Earth, capturing incoming sunlight and redirecting it towards specific locations on the ground for short periods of time, with the ability to control not just where the light goes, but also how intense it is, ranging from something as soft as moonlight to levels closer to early morning daylight. And because these satellites are constantly in motion while the Earth rotates beneath them, the entire system depends on continuous real-time calculations to align angle, timing, and location so precisely that the reflected beam lands exactly where intended, effectively creating a temporary and localized extension of daylight that can be used in situations where producing light on the ground would otherwise require heavy infrastructure. If you think about it from a practical perspective, the shift becomes clearer. A construction site operating overnight normally depends on towers of artificial lighting, generators running continuously, fuel being transported and maintained just to keep the system functioning. But if that same site could receive a controlled beam of sunlight from above at a scheduled time, the operation continues without needing to build or sustain that infrastructure locally. And the same logic applies to ports, industrial zones, and remote facilities where lighting is necessary but difficult to maintain. Even agriculture begins to change when you consider that plant growth is influenced by light cycles, and extending daylight even slightly in regions with limited sunlight can affect how crops develop, not by replacing natural systems, but by adjusting them in a way that wasn't previously possible. All of this points to a shift that is easy to overlook, because sunlight has always been treated as a constant, something that exists independently of human control, arriving and leaving according to natural cycles that we adapt to rather than influence. But once it becomes something that can be directed, scheduled, and applied with intent, it stops being just an environmental condition and starts becoming a resource. The technology is still developing, and it isn't yet part of everyday systems, but the underlying concept has already been proven, and the focus has moved from possibility to control, which suggests that the real change is not in the presence of sunlight, but in how it is used. Because once something that was previously uncontrollable becomes controllable, it rarely stays limited to its original purpose. And sunlight, which has always been present but never placed, is now moving into a category where it can be assigned, directed, and used with intention, which quietly changes the way we think about something that has always felt untouchable. Not because the sun has changed, but because, for the first time, we can decide where its light goes.